The playoffs were underway and the Humboldt Broncos were chasing a championship. For 24-year-old Dayna Brons, there was nowhere else she would rather have been. As an athletic therapist, she travelled with the team, cared for the players, and shared in the highs and lows of a season that had brought them to the brink of something special. The journey to Nipawin that afternoon was simply another step along that road. Around her, young hockey players talked about the game ahead. Nobody was thinking about the journey. Nobody imagined it would be the journey itself that people would remember. Because before the evening was over, a routine trip across rural Saskatchewan would become one of the darkest days in Canadian sporting history. The Humboldt Broncos had been part of life in Saskatchewan for generations. Founded in 1970, the team competed in the Saskatchewan Junior Hockey League and occupied a special place within the community. On game nights, supporters packed the arena to cheer on young players chasing hockey dreams, while volunteers worked tirelessly behind the scenes to keep the organisation running. By the spring of 2018, excitement was building throughout Humboldt. The Broncos were locked in a semi-final playoff series against the Nipawin Hawks. Few people were enjoying this moment more than Dayna Brons. Sport had always been a huge part of her life, and she took genuine satisfaction in helping athletes perform at their best. As athletic therapist, she spent countless hours working with players behind the scenes, treating injuries, monitoring recoveries, and providing support whenever it was needed. It was demanding work, often involving long days and endless travel, but it was exactly where she wanted to be. Those around the team quickly discovered that Dayna brought far more than professional expertise to the role. She had a natural warmth that put people at ease, and an ability to make others feel valued. For Dayna, the Broncos were more than simply a hockey team. They were a group of young people she cared deeply about, and whose successes mattered to her almost as much as they mattered to them. It was one of the reasons she felt so proud to be part of the organisation. And in Humboldt, being part of the Broncos family meant far more than most people realised. Life as a junior hockey player often meant leaving home long before adulthood arrived. Many players moved hundreds of miles away from their parents in pursuit of opportunities that simply did not exist in their own communities. To make that possible, local families opened their home to them, providing somewhere to sleep, somewhere to eat, and perhaps most importantly, a sense of belonging. These were known as billet families. On paper, the arrangement seemed simple. In reality, it was often something much deeper. Teenagers arrived as strangers, carrying hockey bags and nervous excitement. Months later, they were celebrating birthdays together, sharing family meals, and becoming part of everyday life. Many billet parents spoke of the players not as guests, but as additional sons. Some would later describe them as children of our heart. For Dayna, this sense of belonging was one of the things that made the Broncos special. Players looked out for one another. Coaches became mentors. Volunteers gave up countless hours of their time. And behind it all were the families who opened their homes and welcomed young athletes into their lives. Renee Cannon understood that better than most. Over the course of the season, 3 Broncos players, Logan Hunter, Adam Herold, and Xavier Labelle, had become familiar faces in the Cannon household. What had begun as a simple billet arrangement had gradually become something much deeper. So when the Broncos boarded their bus for Nipawin on April the 6th, Renee was not simply watching 3 hockey players leave for another road trip. She was watching 3 young men she had come to love. As the Broncos bus carried the team north towards Nipawin, thoughts naturally turned towards the challenge that awaited them. The Broncos were travelling to Nipawin Centennial Arena for Game 5 of their Saskatchewan Junior Hockey League semi-final series against the Nipawin Hawks. Trailing the series, they needed a victory to keep their season alive. Nobody seemed intimidated by the task. By April 2018, the Broncos had become a close-knit group, united not only by hockey, but by the experiences they had shared throughout the season. If the team needed a steady hand, they often looked towards captain Logan Schatz. At 20 years old, he carried the responsibilities of leadership with a quiet confidence that teammates admired. He was not the loudest voice in the dressing room and rarely sought the spotlight. Yet younger players naturally gravitated towards him. Behind the bench stood head coach Darcy Haugan, a man whose influence extended well beyond hockey. Parents trusted him with their sons. Players respected him. For many young men arriving in Humboldt for the first time, he became a mentor, teacher, and role model all rolled into one. Not everyone on the bus wore a jersey. One of them was 19-year-old Brodie Hintz, the team's statistician. Like many people involved in junior hockey, his contribution often took place off the sheet, recording information that helped coaches and players prepare for the challenges ahead. He wasn't chasing goals or making saves, yet he was every bit as much a part of the team as the athletes on the ice. Brodie simply loved the game. He loved the team and valued the friendships that came with it. Like everyone else aboard the bus that afternoon, he was looking forward to the challenge that awaited them in Nipawin. Dayna understood that philosophy better than most. Like Darcy, she saw more than hockey players when she looked around the bus. She saw young men pursuing dreams, dealing with setbacks, missing home, and trying to find their place in the world. Young men she had spent months supporting through injuries, setbacks, and triumphs. Coaches she respected, friends she had travelled alongside throughout the season. It was another bus journey, another hockey game, and another opportunity to help the people around her succeed, and the stakes that evening were significant. Across Humboldt, parents, friends, and billet families expected to see them again later that evening. There was no reason to think otherwise. Shortly before 3 p.m, the Broncos bus pulled away from Humboldt and began the journey north. Inside, the atmosphere was much as it had been on countless other road trips. Players talked about the game ahead, joked with teammates, and settled into the familiar rhythm of travelling together. Some listened to music through headphones. Others stared out of the windows at the Saskatchewan countryside, while the Broncos made their way towards Nipawin. Another vehicle was travelling through the Saskatchewan countryside. 29-year-old truck driver Jaskirat Singh Sidhu was hauling a load of peat moss along a network of rural highways west of Armley. Like the passengers aboard the Bronco bus, he expected the day to pass without incident. It was simply another journey through a landscape he had travelled before. At that moment, the people aboard the bus knew nothing about Sidhu, and Sidhu knew nothing about them. Yet somewhere ahead, on a quiet stretch of Saskatchewan highway, the routes of those two vehicles were slowly drawing together. Neither journey seemed remarkable. Neither gave any indication of what was about to happen. But with every passing mile, the distance between them continued to shrink. As the Broncos bus continued north, the miles slipped by unnoticed. Players discussed the challenge awaiting them in Nipawin. Others exchanged jokes and stories. It was, by every measure, an ordinary journey. Ahead of them lay the intersection of Highway 35 and Highway 335, near the tiny community of Armley. Drivers travelling along Highway 35 enjoyed the right-of-way. Vehicles approaching from Highway 335 faced a different set of instructions entirely. Warning signs stood beside the road. Closer to the intersection, flashing red lights and large stop signs reinforced the same simple message: stop, yield to traffic, and do not proceed until the crossing was clear. Thousands of drivers obeyed those instructions every year without giving them a second thought. On April the 6th, 2018, one driver would not. As the Broncos bus rolled steadily towards the intersection, nobody on board had any reason to be concerned. The road was dry, visibility stretched for miles beneath the clear sky, and there was little traffic on the surrounding highways. Everything about the afternoon suggested a routine journey. Everything except the fact that two vehicles were now approaching the same patch of road at precisely the same moment. The bus continued north, the truck continued west, and with every passing second the opportunity to avoid disaster grew smaller. At approximately 5 p.m, the Broncos bus approached the intersection near Armley. Approaching from the west was the semi-trailer truck driven by Jaskirat Singh Sidhu. For reasons that would later become the focus of intense scrutiny, the truck failed to stop at the intersection and continued into the path of the oncoming bus. By the time the danger became apparent, there was almost no time left to react. The bus driver slammed on the brakes, leaving skid marks on the highway, but there was nowhere to go. A moment later, the front of the Broncos bus crashed into the lead trailer of the truck at highway speed. The force of the collision was catastrophic. The impact tore through the front section of the bus, ripping away much of its structure and causing devastating damage throughout the vehicle. Metal screamed against metal, and glass exploded into the interior. Seats were torn from their mountings. Equipment, luggage, and personal belongings were hurled through the air. Players, coaches, and staff who had been discussing hockey only moments earlier were thrown violently from their seats as the bus disintegrated around them. For many aboard, there was no time to comprehend what was happening. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Thoughts of the game disappeared beneath an overwhelming explosion of noise and movement. When the violence finally stopped, wreckage lay scattered across the roadside, and a routine journey to a playoff hockey game had been transformed into one of the darkest days in Canadian sporting history. The journey had ended in an instant. For those who survived, the experience would remain difficult to describe. Some remembered only fragments. Others recalled a sudden explosion of noise, followed by confusion and darkness. Several would later speak of desperately trying to understand what had happened, as they searched for teammates, friends and colleagues amongst the wreckage. On a clear spring afternoon that had begun with hopes of extending a playoff run, the lives of everyone connected to the Humboldt Broncos had been changed forever. First responders arriving at the scene were confronted by devastation stretching across the roadside. Twisted wreckage, injured survivors, and the desperate search for those trapped created scenes few would ever forget. As emergency crews worked among the wreckage, news of the collision began spreading across Saskatchewan. At first, details were scarce. There had been an accident involving the Humboldt Broncos bus, but beyond that very little was known. Families, friends and supporters found themselves searching for information, hoping that the reports reaching them were somehow exaggerated or mistaken. They were not. At hospitals across the province, doctors, nurses and trauma teams prepared for an influx of casualties unlike anything many of them had ever experienced. Air ambulances carried the most seriously injured away from the scene, while police officers worked to identify victims and establish exactly who had been on board. For those connected to the Broncos, the uncertainty was agonising. Parents who had spent the afternoon expecting to watch a hockey game suddenly found themselves waiting for phone calls that seemed to take forever to arrive. For Sharon Struby, the aunt of Broncos statistician Brodie Hintz, the nightmare began with a simple phone call after she returned home to Edmonton. Her daughter had seen reports of the crash and called with a sentence that would remain etched in her memory forever. "I think Brodie was on the bus." There was no certainty in those words, just a growing sense of dread and the horrifying possibility that someone she loved might be caught up in the disaster unfolding hundreds of miles away on a Saskatchewan highway. Across the province, countless others were enduring the same ordeal. Renee Cannon was one of them. Only hours earlier she had watched Logan Hunter, Adam Herold and Xavier Labelle leave for another road trip. Now she found herself waiting for news. As the evening progressed, fragments of information slowly became clearer. Some players had survived. Others had suffered life-threatening injuries. Several had not survived the impact at all. Among those rushed to hospital was Dayna Brons. Severely injured but alive, she became one of the many patients doctors fought desperately to save. The full extent of her injuries was not yet known, and while the situation remained critical, loved ones clung on to the possibility that somehow she might recover. Throughout the night, families continued arriving at hospitals, gathering in waiting rooms and searching for answers. Some received news that brought relief. Others received news that would change their lives forever. In the days that followed, Saskatchewan found itself suspended between grief and hope. The names of those lost in the crash gradually became known, each announcement sending fresh waves of sorrow through communities already struggling to comprehend what had happened. Across the province, families mourned sons, brothers, friends and teammates whose lives had ended on a stretch of highway that should have been just another part of the journey. Hockey communities from coast to coast held vigils. Professional teams observed moments of silence. Messages of support arrived from across North America as people struggled to comprehend how a routine bus journey had ended in such devastation. Yet, amid the heartbreak, many people found themselves focusing on those who were still fighting for their lives. And among those still battling her injuries was Dayna Brons. News that she had survived the collision spread quickly. Friends, former athletes, members of the hockey community, and complete strangers followed every update, hoping for signs of improvement. The outpouring of support was extraordinary. People who had never met Dayna learned about the young woman and found themselves willing her to recover. Doctors continued to fight for her, and for a time hope remained. Then, on April the 11th, 5 days after the crash, that hope came to an end. Dayna Brons died from the injuries she had sustained in the collision. She was 24 years old. The death toll now stood at 16. 16 lives, 16 futures. 16 empty seats at dinner tables. And as communities gathered to mourn, stories began emerging that revealed not only who these people had been, but why so many would refuse to let them be forgotten. As news spread further across Canada, the response was unlike anything many people had witnessed before. Hockey occupies a unique place in Canadian life. In cities and small towns alike, generations grow up with skates on their feet and hockey sticks in their hands. Parents spend countless hours driving children to practices before dawn. Families gather around televisions to watch games. Entire communities rally around local teams. The Humboldt Broncos were one such team. What happened on April the 6th felt deeply personal, even to people who had never heard of Humboldt before that evening. Outside homes across Canada, hockey sticks started appearing on front porches, leaning against front doors and garage walls. Some belonged to children. Others had not been used in years. A few had belonged to players who had long since grown up and left home. The gesture became known as "Put Your Sticks Out." It required no speeches and no explanation. A hockey stick resting quietly beside a front door became a way of saying that the Broncos were not grieving alone. For the families, the support was overwhelming. Yet amid the grief, stories also began to emerge about the lives that had been lost. One of the most remarkable legacies to emerge from the disaster belonged to 21-year-old Logan Boulet. Friends remembered him as energetic, generous, and endlessly willing to help others. Just weeks before the crash, Logan had attended a charity event where he heard the story of a young athlete whose life had been saved by an organ transplant. The experience stayed with him, and, inspired by what he had heard, Logan registered as an organ donor. It was a simple decision, one made without any expectation that it would ever attract attention or change lives beyond his own. Then came April the 6th. In the days following the crash, doctors determined that Logan's injuries were too severe for him to survive. Faced with unimaginable grief, his family made the decision to honour his wishes and proceed with organ donation. 6 lives were saved. Yet the impact of Logan's decision extended beyond those 6 people. As Canadians learned about his story, something extraordinary began to happen. Across the country, people started registering as organ donors in unprecedented numbers. The phenomenon became known as the Logan Boulet effect. In the midst of one of the country's darkest moments, a young man who would never return home had inspired countless others to give strangers a second chance at life. For his family, it was a source of comfort amid unimaginable heartbreak. For Canada, it became a reminder that acts of compassion can echo far beyond the lives of the people who first make them. Long before Canadians learned her name, Dayna Brons had quietly made helping others a part of everyday life. One example was her commitment to regular blood donation, a habit that attracted little attention at the time, but would later take on a much deeper significance. In the months following the disaster, that part of Dayna's story began inspiring others. Among those deeply affected was Stu Middleton, a former junior hockey player whose own father had been killed in a road accident while travelling to watch him play many years earlier. When he learned more about Dayna and the life she had lived, her story resonated with him in a profound way. Alongside his friend Tanner Murray, Middleton helped launch Hockey Gives Blood, an organisation dedicated to encouraging blood stem cell and organ donation throughout the hockey community. In time, the organisation established the Dayna Brons Honorary Award, recognising members of the hockey community who demonstrated the same generosity, compassion and commitment to helping others that had defined her life. For Dayna's family, it was a deeply meaningful tribute. The award ensured that people would remember not only how she died, but how she lived. Years after the crash, her name continues to be associated with kindness, service, and a willingness to put others before herself. It's a legacy she never set out to create, yet perhaps that is why it feels so fitting. While communities across Canada worked to honour the victims and support the survivors, investigators were attempting to answer a question that continued to haunt families, friends, and an entire nation. How had something so devastating been allowed to happen on an ordinary spring afternoon? The answer, when it emerged, was both devastating and disturbingly simple. There had been no mechanical failure or speeding. There were no hidden defects in the road itself. As officers and accident reconstruction specialists pieced together the final moments before the crash, a troubling picture began to emerge. All drivers approaching the crossing encountered warnings. Large stop signs required traffic to come to a complete halt before crossing Highway 35. But on that day, Sidhu had become distracted as he approached the intersection. Rather than focusing on the road ahead, he was paying attention to a loose tarp on his trailer that had been flapping in the wind, and was monitoring it through his mirrors. In those critical moments, he failed to register the significance of the warnings leading up to the crossing, and continued into the intersection without stopping. Investigators did examine Sidhu's mobile phone in detail and found no evidence that it had been in use at the time of the collision. Nor was there any evidence that alcohol, drugs, fatigue, poor visibility or adverse weather conditions had played a role. The findings left many families struggling to understand how so many warnings could be missed. That question became even more pressing as attention turned towards the trucking company involved. Investigators uncovered concerns relating to driver training, record keeping and regulatory compliance. In the months that followed, criticism extended beyond the actions of a single driver and towards a wider system that some believed had failed long before the Broncos bus reached the intersection near Armley. For grieving families, those questions mattered, not because answers could bring loved ones back, but because they desperately wanted to understand how a routine journey to a hockey game had ended in such unimaginable loss. In January 2019, Jaskirat Singh Sidhu pleaded guilty to 16 counts of dangerous driving causing death and 13 counts of dangerous driving causing bodily harm. Unlike many defendants in serious road traffic cases, Sidhu did not attempt to blame the weather, road conditions or the sun. He accepted responsibility for his actions and acknowledged that his failure to stop had caused the collision. The guilty plea spared families a lengthy trial, but it did not bring an end to the pain. In March 2019, the court sentenced Sidhu to 8 years in prison, the longest sentence ever imposed in Canada for dangerous driving offences. For some families, the sentence felt appropriate. For others, no punishment could ever feel proportionate to the lives that had been lost. Yet even then, the story was not over. After serving his sentence, Sidhu was scheduled to be deported from Canada. For some families, there was little uncertainty about how they felt. 16 people had lost their lives. Parents had buried children. Friends had attended funerals. Communities had been changed forever. From that perspective, deportation seemed a natural consequence of the events that had unfolded at the intersection near Armley. Others struggled with the issue in a different way. Sidhu had pleaded guilty. He had accepted responsibility for the collision and expressed remorse for the devastation it had caused. By then, he had also become a husband and a father. Supporters pointed to the fact that one of his children suffered from a serious lung condition, and being deported to India would be detrimental to the child's life. They also argued that he had already paid a heavy price for the mistake that would define the rest of his life. As deportation dates were delayed and legal appeals continued, the debate refused to fade away. Canadians found themselves confronting uncomfortable questions that offered no easy answers. How should justice be measured after a disaster of this scale? Can any punishment truly reflect the loss of 16 lives? And where, if anywhere, does forgiveness fit into the story? Years after the collision, people still disagreed. What remained beyond dispute, however, was the human cost. No legal ruling or appeal could alter what happened on April 6, 2018, and no decision made in a courtroom could return the people who never came home. For the families left behind, that reality remained unchanged, regardless of where the legal process ultimately led. Today, the highways of rural Saskatchewan look much as they did on that April afternoon in 2018. Traffic still passes through the intersection near Armley. Farmers travel between communities. Hockey teams continue making the long journeys that have always been part of life across the Canadian prairies. To a stranger passing through, there is little to suggest that one of Canada's most devastating sporting disasters unfolded there. Yet, for the families connected to the Humboldt Broncos, the passage of time has never erased the people who were lost. Parents still remember sons who never came home. Friends remember conversations left unfinished. Teammates remember empty seats on buses and in dressing rooms. And billet families remember young men who arrived carrying hockey bags and dreams, only to become something far more important. Renee Cannon knew that feeling all too well. Over the course of a season, Logan Hunter, Adam Herold and Xavier Labelle had become part of her family. What began as a billet arrangement gradually became something much deeper. They shared meals together, celebrated successes together, and became woven into the fabric of everyday life. When the Broncos bus left for Nipawin, Renee watched the boys go as she had many times before. 2 of them never came home. Logan Hunter and Adam Herold were among those killed in the crash. Xavier Labelle survived, but suffered life-changing injuries. When people spoke about the Broncos after the crash, one phrase appeared again and again: children of our heart. Perhaps no words better capture why this story continues to resonate so deeply. The victims were not distant celebrities or professional athletes living behind walls of fame. They were young men who sat at family dinner tables, helped to carry groceries into the house, celebrated birthdays, and became part of the communities that welcomed them. They arrived as strangers, they left as family. For Dayna Brons, helping those young men succeed had never been a job. It had been a privilege. The same was true for coaches like Darcy Haugan, for volunteers, billet families, and countless others who devoted themselves to the Broncos organisation. What happened on April 6, 2018 took 16 lives, but it could not take the impact those lives had on the people around them. The kindness of Dayna Brons, the leadership of Logan Schatz, the generosity of Logan Boulet, the guidance of Darcy Haugan, the dedication of Brody Hintz, whose love for the game saw him contribute from behind the scenes as the team's statistician, the friendship, laughter and dreams shared by an entire generation of young hockey players. Those things endure, and perhaps that is the real legacy of the Humboldt Broncos. Not the crash, not the court case, not even the grief that followed, but the reminder that the strongest communities are built through the connections people forge with one another, and that sometimes those connections become so deep that family is no longer defined by blood alone. Because long after the final buzzer has sounded, and long after the headlines have faded, the people lost that day remain exactly what they had become to so many: children of our heart. Now, this particular disaster struck a chord with me. I think it's always very poignant when young lives are just cut short, all of that potential just lost forever. Despite the nature of the tragedy, I hope you appreciated the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.